matters and really focus on aligning philanthropic investments with community realities. And I think this is probably the most sought after of all of our panels in our program. I think everyone's really eager to speak with funders and hear your perspective. So I just want to give you a really warm welcome to our two panelists. We have two practitioners today who really think hard about how philanthropic and mission-driven capital actually reaches and reflects communities and their needs. And the participants that we have here today are really a lot of those people that represent the community and their needs. Many of them just returned back from Our Oceans conference. Mariko, I think you had a chance to meet a lot of them in person, which is fantastic. And I've been following the WhatsApp chat, seeing all the amazing pictures and hearing all of the great stories. So I'm excited to hear more from them, but I think this is a really timely conversation in terms of coming back from there and being able to talk directly with the two of you. So I am not going to go into too much detail, but just as a housekeeping thing, for those who haven't attended these sessions yet, this conversation is really designed to be less of a presentation and more of a dialogue. So I'm going to kind of skip the introductions, keep them really brief, and then get right to the exchange. And as a secondary point, I am solo parenting today. And so if a little 4.5-year-old wanders in and sits on my lap, don't be surprised, but I will continue through. Okay, so getting to introductions. First, I'm going to introduce Leo Pradella. He's a program officer at the Walton Family Foundation. And Mariko Powers, who's a program officer at Oceankind. And instead of me doing their introductions, I was thinking that I'm going to hand it over to them to do really short introductions of themselves and their background. So you guys can hear from them directly and get to know them a little bit better. So I'm going to start with you, Mariko.
Hey, everybody. It's so great to see some of you again. I had the pleasure of meeting some of you last week in Kenya, which already feels like a long time ago. And I'm really excited to reconnect with you all. I was really impressed with those of you that I had the opportunity to connect with. I'm Mariko. I'm a program officer at Oceankind. Specifically, I manage our conservation portfolio. So that's our work that's dedicated towards advancing better fisheries management, habitat protections, kind of everything but pollution, as we just kind of ran out of bandwidth, so we don't do much pollution funding, but most other topics we do cover. And we have a really interesting split in our approach. We either do core support to organizations that we think are really critical to the field. So organizations you may have heard of like Global Fishing Watch, Environmental Justice Fund at the global level. And then we also fund several nationally active groups. And then the work that isn't core support, we tend to support policy advocacy campaigns to secure those policy reforms that advance ocean health. What else to say? I joined Oceankind in 2018, which is when it started. But prior to that, the only other experience I have living outside of the US has been in Southeast Asia. So I had the good fortune to live in Thailand off and on, and I've spent a few months in Manila and the Philippines, and from those places have been able to travel around quite a bit. So I do have the region is near and dear to my heart. So I'm very excited to have the chance to chat with you more today.
Thanks so much, Mariko. Leo, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, good evening. I don't know where everyone is dialing in from. I'm Leo. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I'm a program officer at the Walton Family Foundation. I've been with the team for almost 4.5 years now, and I don't have a background in Southeast Asia. I don't have a background in marine biology or science. I come from Brazil, and I used to work on forest conservation across the Amazon, working with indigenous and traditional peoples before coming to the US some 14 years ago. And I've been living here since, working across the corporate sustainability space, retailers and banks, and more recently here at the foundation. Just a little bit of context, the foundation where I am, we divide our portfolio across 3 main areas. One around legal protections here in the US exclusively, some work on enabling policy and a lot of policy advocacy across a number of different issue areas, including marine resources, fisheries, and coastal protections. and a third one around markets, changing market behavior, corporate procurement, corporate accountability more broadly, where I spend a lot of my time. And just for context here, how I show up in this, I part of my time is working on corporate accountability agendas, but the second half of my time is working on fisheries that we support across Indonesia. The foundation has been working in Indonesian context for probably well over 20 years now, uh, since the early days of helping set up establish marine protected areas and across Raja Ampat, evolving the portfolio over time to work on fishery adjacents, like fisheries that are adjacent to those MPAs, and then more recently focusing exclusively on fisheries. So I get to spend a lot of time in Indonesia. I was just there last month. I missed the opportunity to go to the ocean conference. I would not make that mistake again. But I try as much as I can to stay grounded to the working with our partners across Indonesia. Looking forward to the discussion, and thanks for the invitation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much. And I can attest to Leo's involvement working with local organizations. I've collaborated with him on the Indonesia fisheries work for a couple of years now, and it's incredibly impressive. He asks the right questions, and I'm sure he may be asking some of those questions to you all as we kind of have a good dialogue here today. So I'm going to kick it off with the first question that I have. I'm going to kind of go, I think that the way I'll organize it today is lead on my questions till around 9:30 and then open it up to the participants to ask them some questions. And I have lots of questions to fill in if there's any extra time. So to start, I'm gonna reinforce the framing here, which is aligning with community realities. And what we mean by that is not just serving communities, but the real difference between aligning with the community realities and serving communities. So I want to ask the two panelists what they think is the difference and why does it matter to you? Who wants to start? I'll let you guys choose.
I'll jump in. If that's an amazing question, and I would say, like, I may have one answer, and I know there's perhaps more than one here. And what I'll share, it's not necessarily a reflection of how we work, but perhaps how we aspire to work. I think a lot of the distinction is where the power lives, right? Where choices get made. You can serve a community, I would think, but if you set the metrics, if you set the timeline, if you set the budget, if you set the priorities, if you set everything, you as the funder, I mean, you are serving, but are you really aligning with it? And so it's a lot of where the power dimension is, right? That's, I think, the main distinction. And I think we'll cover a lot of this in the discussion today. But sometimes things fail because we don't know, what those priorities are at the local level. And sometimes a good idea on paper, will take years for us to learn if they work or if they don't, just because we didn't have that alignment going in. So we aspire to have that proximity and be able to share, some of the decision making that exists in the space. But I would say, as we'll talk more about, it doesn't always work the way we plan or the way we hope for a lot of complexities that we'll get into.
Yeah, I think those are great comments. And just to add on, I think it's really about positioning communities as beneficiaries or positioning communities as the resource managers and really centering their agency. And then I think when we talk about realities, it's like that for me is really about checking your assumptions about what the problems or the priorities should be. As a funder, I think we try to do that and to really ensure that whatever the work is that it's grounded in a real understanding of what the community's experience day to day. I think, community realities, sometimes you have to really appreciate the remoteness of a place or the activities that make up someone's day in order to fully understand what's within the realm of possible when you're talking about various interventions. And so I really also appreciate the question because I think it's a great one to keep front and center.
Thank you both. I think that probably resonates with a lot of the people on the line. So next I'm going to go to you, Leo. So Walton Family Foundation's scale is quite large when it comes to the amount of funding and grants that you provide. So within that large scale, how do you maintain a genuine community attunement to what is happening at a local level?
Sure, and for context, the foundation, the environment program where I am, uh, on average each year gives out about $110 million across, it averages between 400 and 450 grants. Uh, the majority of them between $500,000 and $1 million. So they're not small by any means, but they're not massive either. So a lot of these there was a lot of process to do that. And it seemed practical at that scale to have, all the metrics, all the deeply contextual nuances that live across each one of these grants and across each one of the communities that we work on. And so knowing that exists, we don't have a center, like a database that tracks all of this consistently, because we always have to simplify, like how do you explain 400 grants, right? All dealing with different local contexts. So we have to use the resource that we have available to us, right? So we try as much as we can, like site visits, peer learnings, grantee convenings. We have in-country advisors across all the countries that we work outside of the U.S. and a number of other consultants in the U.S. Trying to get as close as we can, knowing that I'm based in Washington D.C. I get to go to Indonesia twice a year, and maybe I spend a month or so every year there. It's not enough to know all the realities of the work that we do, and even the multitude of perspectives that exist even in a single place where we work. So we use the resources that we can in taking advantage of the partnerships that we establish over the year, trying to build trust and really understand what exists and what doesn't. And most of this trust is built over time. I don't think we have this expectation that suddenly we're going to jump into a new place or a new community and the work is just gonna materialize. So we try to build time through the portfolio grants that we have to enable our grantees, our local partners or our local implementers, to build that trust and relay back to us the local knowledge that informs our future grant making.
Thanks, Leo. And Mariko, I'm going to turn to you because OceanKind has a different type of model. So how does that model kind of shape what you and your team can fund or advocate for?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So OceanKind, at least the portfolio that I manage, the conservation portfolio, as is in the name, it justifies proposed grants in terms of potential conservation outcomes, which isn't to say that we don't also care about social outcomes or we don't care about equity dimensions. I think we really try to make sure that anything we support wouldn't advance or exacerbate negative social outcomes, but I do have to justify the grant in terms of the potential conservation benefits. We're pretty flexible, I'd say, about how those outcomes are reached and what success looks like. So for example, we don't have like a quantitative area-based target of area under conservation or management or anything like that we're trying to achieve. But at the end of the day, I do have to articulate the grant rationale in terms of its potential benefits for ocean health. So that does kind of constrain what we look at, what we prioritize for funding. And then maybe another interesting thing to note about OceanKind's approach to philanthropy is that we fund organizations and we fund policy advocacy, but we generally don't go very deep in places. So perhaps very polar opposite to the Walton Family Foundation, we don't have a deeply place-based strategy. And that means, that comes with trade-offs. So that means we can be really flexible and opportunistic. We can fund pretty much anywhere around the world if there is political will and a compelling opportunity. But that means that in order to maintain that flexibility, we don't really have the deep commitment to any one place. And with that, you sometimes miss supporting the full ecosystem of enabling conditions that's needed for interventions to succeed in that one place. And sometimes I do wish that we were that type of funder so that we could just go deep and put and help all of the pieces, whether those are social and cultural, as well as environment, terrestrial and marine, because I think everything is connected. But that's not our current setup. So, yeah.
It's really interesting. And there's definitely trade-offs to both types of models, I think. And maybe that's kind of the beauty of it, is that the different models can complement one another and provide flexibility in different contexts. I'm going to shift a little bit with this next question and talk about kind of, I'm curious if you guys can walk us through a funding decision that was actually shaped or changed by what you heard from a community or a community-based organization, and what specifically shifted for you, and what did that require of your organization? And this can be obviously a success story or maybe not a success story, but I think understanding kind of what pushed that shift and then what it requires at an organizational level is interesting. Mariko, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, and it's maybe worth caveating that we often rely on our NGO partners to kind of relay community priorities. I don't do that much direct interaction with communities, again, because of this lack of a deep place-based strategy. But and I feel like it can set a lot of expectations when a funder meets directly with communities around long-term engagement and building trust directly, that I feel like is so anyway, sometimes we're a bit at arm's length. But I have been in one. I did go with a partner to do some field site visits in South Africa, which is a place where there is a lot of tensions around conservation between communities, a lot of mistrust with park authorities. This NGO isn't the park authority, but has collaborated with the park authority in the past. And this was kind of about promoting fisheries co-management and an MPA with the community. And it was evident from participating in that field trip that there still was some trust building that needed to happen. And we came to a meeting with the local kind of fishers, and they straight up said, like, we are happy to work with you, but come again and come several more times and we'll keep talking. And they were very explicit that they were not ready to just move ahead and right away. And that really reinforced to me that a lot of this work needs to move at the pace of trust. And I think that meant that the project didn't get started on the timeline that we thought it would, and that's okay. I think that funders need to be flexible and not just expect that a conservation NGO can show up and start doing work that's not grounded in a very clear consent from the community to proceed. So that's just one specific example that I can think of.
I think that line, that the work moves at a pace of trust, is actually a really interesting and accurate way to frame it. Leo, why don't we go to you?
Sure. Can I be shameless and make a plug for something that just got launched yesterday?
Of course.
I'm gonna put on the chat. You guys can check out. This is I hope the link works. This is from our one of our grantees, Starling Resources. They work in West Java and in Lampung, and a little bit in Central Java as well. What you're seeing, this was launched, I think it was yesterday. I received the notification about this yesterday from them, but it doesn't capture. This is the outcome of something that happened maybe 2.5 years ago in one of the site visits that they took me to themselves, the Coral Triangle Center and EDF, some of our grantees that work in the blue swimming crab fishery, where we were in the process of phasing those work out, and we still are. By the end of this year, we're no longer going to be funding that fishery anymore. So we're trying to figure out, okay, what is the path to institutionalization here? How do we do this? How do we sunset this program in the most responsible way? What's the mechanism that we need to account for? There are a lot of things that we're trying to do at the policy level. What is the angle that we need to introduce here for this sunsetting, for this exit that is grounded in the community realities? And every place that we went, and we went through across 7 different villages from East Lampung, and then we crossed back to Java and went to the north coast of West Java. Every community had a different thing that they wanted to do, but they never, like in terms of alternative livelihoods, like different types of income that they wanted to pursue, ways of harvesting or protecting the bearing females for the crabs. There are different approaches, and there was nothing consistent about any of them. And the idea came up through where it was a result of this side visit, like maybe we should just come up with a fund and let them figure that out. Like, what is it? What makes more sense to them? Because like building pretty much on what Mariko said, Like there's no there's like a lot of this has to be grounded on what they are motivated to do. Like our priorities are not necessarily their priorities, and sometimes it clashes, right? So is there a mechanism that we can create to enable some of these community-led approaches in a way that we normally don't fund? For those not familiar with the Walton Family Foundation, the grants are very rigid. It's very, very rare that we're able to do general support grants. Only for the rarest exceptions internationally, we're not able to do this generally. So this one, even though this fund is very small in dollar amounts or relatively small in dollar amounts, um, it took a different infrastructure internally to navigate, but we were able to justify by grounding on those experiences that we see, like going to the field and just learning from different communities. Like we want to do this thing, but what we actually care about is something a little bit different. So if we're able to work on both of these things, maybe we can collaborate.
It's great. I didn't realize you guys were continuing to fund this next component of the Blue Swimming Crab in Lampoon. So I'm excited to see that. But also, I think when you fund it like this, it's like in a way you can compare and contrast across the different approaches and take some of those learnings, share them across the different communities, and also just kind of have a good foundation to understand what works and what doesn't, and at least getting towards more about like how. So that's great. Congratulations on that. My next question is, where do funders' priorities and community priorities diverge? And then how do you navigate that divergence honestly? Leo, why don't we start with you?
Sure. And this is a caveat that's probably worth saying, that each funder is very unique, right? One funder, right? Like where the money comes from, what the strategic priorities are. So uh, my experience might be very distinct from Mariko's experience, and it might be very distinct from other funder experiences. Um, that's just worth calling out, because our strategy is grounded on environmental outcomes, right? And sometimes there are places where that clashes with the priorities in the local for the local communities that we serve or that we work with. There's one example. I'm going to bring only examples in Indonesian, so apologies for not having a more diverse set. But this one is in North Minahasa, just north of Manado in North Sulawesi, where one of our partners work in a fishing community there that mostly targets tuna. It's a fishing village. Spend most of the time catching tuna, but their main priority is they saw a neighboring village open an eco lodge, and it has been very successful. So they wanted to open one of those as well to diversify the income. But their village is in an estuary, and there's a lot of trash that comes down the river and ends up in where they are. So their main priority in their village fund, and that board that sits outside the village, is waste management. That's what they want to do. Ecotourism and waste management. We don't fund any of that. And that's a fishing community. So how do we reconcile this? We cannot. There's no way for me to come back and say we're going to start a plastics program in this specific village. There's no way to do that. That's the clash that exists. But we have to be very creative, right? Knowing that there are limits to how much we can do in terms of our own direct funding. Like, who else works here? Like, we need to rely on funder networks and peers, and trying to understand what else exists in this, either in this region or across these issue areas, or groups that work in the fishing space that may have affinity towards these agendas, that facilitates access or try to coordinate agendas. So all I'm saying, like the through line here, is we as funders have to fundraise. For our own portfolio to succeed, we might need to bring another group, or need to introduce this issue area to other funders that have been perhaps more motivated to those agendas that we simply cannot go after.
That's a really great example. Thanks for sharing that. Mariko, I'm handing it over to you.
Yeah, plus one to the things that Leo said, and maybe I'll just add on by saying it makes me really excited. There's a lot more funder interest now in kind of using the language of tenure rights when it comes to the marine and coastal context. And by that I mean the securing community and local people's rights to manage and their coastal areas and the manage the resources in those areas. And that is really exciting. And I think the presumption and the expectation is that with rights comes responsibilities, and the responsibility then to manage those resources in ways that are sustainable. But there is the anxiety, because having those fisheries to be sustainable would be in their own self-interest. That's like the assumption. But I think the underlying anxiety that some conservation funders might have is that maybe the rights will be secured, but then those really tough decisions around advancing closed areas or gear changes or reducing fishing capacity, or in some cases even undergoing like occupational transition where people maybe don't fish anymore, is like those are really not easy conversations. And so I think we tend to support organizations and projects that where there's organizations that can work to build the confidence of those local communities or those fisher associations that those management shifts are possible. And so whether they're building the confidence of the communities themselves that they can make those rules, or building the confidence of the government partners that they can design and implement those policies in a thoughtful way, is a lot of the work we tend to support. But that's where I think we start to see the rub between like community and conservation funder interests is when it comes to very, very tough conversations like that.
And I think that's a good segue. I see that John Ray has a question in the chat, so I'll read it here. He says that there are some funders who also have fixed funding cycles that usually means stopping and halting the project at a local level. So how do you break even with this challenge and continue implementing the project without the funders' support? Do either of you have any input for that or advice? USAID is an example, which I know Leo has had to kind of work along the margins of.
Sure, I'll jump in. That one was like, and Charlie, you've been very much closer to this than I have in many respects. The USAID, what happened last year, they're irreplaceable funder, and to a large degree, even across our work as being a large funder, it doesn't even come close to the level of the scale and the types of relationships that a funder like USAID is able to do. So there is no way to make up that gap, right? But we can be nimble in how do we use the resources that we already have. That doesn't mean that we're going to make more fun, enable more funds to try to cover certain things, but trying to not lose sight of what in the case of USAID, what was left behind. The experience that we had earlier last year was we had a co-funding, sort of a co-funding arrangement with USAID on a tuna project, or was associated with tunas. And there's a lot of knowledge, a lot of institutional knowledge that was living, a lot of technical expertise that live under the funding from USAID, and that could not be missed or it could not be lost. So the approach was to temporarily bring them into our grants to buy them time, right? Ensure until we got the final conclusion of what their funding was going to, what was going to happen in USAID, as an attempt to preserve those relationships and the expertise that was already happening and that was already being deployed on some policy advocacy work that both us and USAID had. There is not, that's very unique, and that one came from more of a tragedy, right? There are circumstances where you may want to look at this as, how do you build your relationship with that funder that has those more strict guidelines. We may be one of them, but we know of funders that are even more strict ones that only approve for grants 4 times a year, right? You like, is there opening to work with them so that they can introduce you to other groups that have more flexibility? What resources exist beyond core grant making or the strategic grant making that enables you to live through those waves of funding, those peaks and valleys that exist consistently across the funding landscape? I would say it's a lot of being very honest with the funders they already have. Let them know as early as you can what does that mean to you, right? What decisions do you need to make and by when about your program, and that generally triggers a response within or across the funding community of like, this is an emergency, or this is something that needs prioritization, this requires additional effort that isn't just a regular management of a grant. So I would say like proactively reach out to your funders as soon as you know what circumstances they will affect your capacity to continue implementing the work. That builds trust. They will trust you more by knowing this, because it just break this idea that you shouldn't go to funders with bad news. Sometimes that's what needs to show up. Let them know what the realities are, and let them be a resource to help you navigate through these circumstances.
Marika, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, this is a perpetual challenge in the field. I think that's the blessing and the curse of money, right? Is that it, or philanthropy? It's like it's great when it's there, and it really is sucks when it leaves. And I think that is just going to be a perpetual dynamic. I think funders ask themselves, have a lot of anxiety themselves about the sustainability of the things they fund after they leave. And I think that's like discussion now about MPAs, like both private and public, or multilateral, bilateral, and private funders have sunk a lot of money into MPA designation, but then there's no funding to ensure that they're actually implemented. So I think these are really kind of meta level questions for the field too, around how we meet the biodiversity funding gap and the climate implementation gap and all kinds of things. I think in the best instances, I'll name Packard because I feel like they've done this fairly well. Is some foundations have really thoughtful exit strategies, and they, for example, will sponsor other funders to go do a learning trip in a place to maybe see if they would be interested in, when Packard knew that they were leaving Mexico, they sponsored learning trips for other donors to be able to go learn about that place and engage with the organizations that they had funded for a long time. I think when MAVA sunsetted in West Africa, they developed a whole website with reports that their grantees had made and resources from various exit interviews that they had done about all of the things their funding had accomplished, and hoping that would become kind of like a library that would live on. And that others would be able to find their work. I think, as Leo was saying, funders can do a good job of introducing their grantees to other funders, so that even if they're exiting a project, maybe referring them to other groups that may have interest. So I think there are ways for us to do this responsibly, but in the broader context of it always being challenging.
And I think, so I'm not on the panel, but just to add a little bit, especially in the context of the USAID programming, I think that it was always a significant challenge, the kind of like large amounts of money that were influxed into the system, and then the quick pulling back and the uncertainty if USAID would fund it moving forward in their next funding cycle. And I think what I've learned working in that space for 15 years is kind of creative partnerships and being cognizant of other revenue generating models and integrating that into your organization's models is really effective. Diversifying your funding streams, so not relying on one or two philanthropic donors, but really thinking about kind of different types of partnerships that might work with different types of organizations. I think especially now with the collapse of USAID, there is such a gap, especially in environmental funding. And so, like Leo was saying, philanthropy can't fill that gap. So having creative partnerships with private sector, with government, with other organizations is really an effective way to be able to bridge that. And then the third thing, which I think it's complicated and complex, is thinking about managed growth of NGOs. So oftentimes, especially with this USAID funding, and I have been guilty of this, stepping in, finding a really great partner to work with locally, giving them a lot of money to implement, but in a really fast time period. And so if there is not a second wave of funding, that's not really helping them to manage their growth and thinking about how to maintain that in their staffing levels and the way the organization functions. So being transparent with your partners, with your donors, and saying like, how do you manage that growth, I think is a really smart thing and mature thing to be doing for an organization. Um, and that's my 2 cents on it. But I'm going to open it up to others on the line to ask questions. Rio, silakan.
Yes, thank you, Charla. Yes, hello everyone. I'm Rio from Blue Forest in Indonesia. Hello again, Mariko. Uh, yeah, very great discussion from the panels. And let me introduce first our organization, Blue Forest. We are 20 years in Indonesia. Our roots are deeply local, shaped by years of learning alongside coastal communities across diverse landscape through this archipelago. And those experiences have shown us that many of challenges discussed globally, like food security, conservation, climate resilience, and livelihood, ultimately converging in the same coastal community. As we continue learning from this community, we are eager to contribute to a global conversation of how investment and partnership can better reflect local realities and aspiration. Um, and this is from your discussion make me reflect and thinking uh, um, about the perspective from the founders, since Mariko uh, saying about exit strategy. Um, and I want to asking about um, working with coastal communities in Indonesia, for example, has taught us about habitat restoration, governance, and livelihood transition are often generational process. As funders think about exit strategies, how do you ensure that local organizations and communities are left with stronger institution, relationship, and capacities, not just complete activities? Yes, what does a successful exit look like from your perspective? Thank you. Sorry, can you copy my
Yeah,
question?
we can. I was waiting to see Mariko if you want to jump in. I'm happy to jump in first. Sure, Rio, thanks for your question, and I feel like I've heard of your work before through Navitri from Waverly Street. Maybe we should talk another time. But the exits, I would say, like it's probably the the worst part of the work the foundation, the program officers and foundations have to do, because it's especially the more you know about the work, the harder those things tend to be, and we are on the easier side of things, right? We're the ones, funding initiatives, and so there was a lot of uh, uh, aspects that we want to account for to make it not just an exit, but to a point like a responsible exit. What does it look like? Some exits because the work is complete, right? We've achieved the goals that we set up to do years ago. The work is done. Um, if you can say that at any given time. Sometimes the work is very successful and it no longer requires philanthropic support. Those are rare, but they do occur. And sometimes the work just doesn't achieve the things that or the approach that we use didn't work, whether because we got something wrong, some assumption wrong early on, or something happened, or maybe the approach really didn't function, right? And we were not able to adapt accordingly. So we need to figure out like why are we exiting before being very, very clear about this, because that trust that we spend years and years building with local communities, with the local implementers and the partners that we work with, how we communicate this is particularly important, because we don't want to say we cannot just say like, oh yeah, we're done, we're moving on, right? It's we want to understand like what's being left behind, what's the legacy of this work. Is this through the institutionalization of practices? What changed? How do you tell the story of how this work is coming to an end? uh, Ideally, perhaps the most appropriate way to do it is what like a lot of what Mariko explained from the Packer Foundations, which I aspire to do this across our portfolio, is like off ramps that can take like 3+ years with gradual decreasing funding of 20% per year. That will be the idea with general support grants. That gives a lot more flexibility for the communities to work on. Doesn't always work that way. I think that's I would say the gold standard, knowing the circumstances, the funders change priorities, change strategies. That would be to me the most appropriate way to do this. We tried, like in our case, we are phasing out our work on blue swimming crab, as I mentioned. By the end of this year, we're no longer going to be funding that fishery anymore. Some of the effort has been to reach out to the local implementers. We don't fund the local implementers. We fund EDF, Starling Resources, Coral Triangle Center, and Sustainable Fisheries Partnership, SFP. We don't fund Mitra Bentala on the groups that receive funding in Lampung. We don't fund the local universities in Lampung and West Java. So we reach out to them and start bringing them in. Like, let's meet, let's see who we can introduce you to. Used organizational capacity assessments from other funders that we were able to adapt to those circumstances. Okay, this is the pattern that we have across all of our local partners. Is there some other resource that we can pull to support them in this transition? So we tried the different tools that are available to us, but I would say there isn't like a right answer, because it's all very deeply contextual. But a lot is what I mentioned earlier, like being very clear about why this exit is taking place, be clear about the timelines, and figure out what within the very resourceful toolbox that funders tend to have, what's available that enables that transition to be smoother and longer, as long as it can be.
Yeah, it's hard to, I mean, it's hard to say what a successful, like what does success look like without kind of getting into the specifics of what it is. But I would say broadly, the things that I would look for to make me feel like, all right, this feels like we're leaving it in a good place is, does it seem like there's going to be enduring capacity, and does it seem like there's going to be enduring commitment? And that commitment could take all types of forms: local community leadership, political commitments, things like that. And the capacity you can think of as technical capacity and kind of maybe more organizational capacity. And I think there's so many great grassroots organizations across Southeast Asia that have really awesome technical capacity. And if anything, the things that might need strengthening are more of the more compliance oriented things that are quite boring. So like, accounting processes and governance and all of that, to be able to continue to secure funding from, your bilats and your other Western donors. It's just like making sure that the organization is able to qualify for those types of grants that might have strict organizational requirements. And so I think I've been thinking a lot lately about how to support grantees, not only with project support funding, but also associated organizational strengthening services and resources that can be put towards that, so that you're leaving not only the place or the conservation outcomes hopefully in a good place, but you're also leaving the organization stronger, that you supported stronger than it was before. So it's another thing to consider.
Thank you.
All right, Mark, you are up next in terms of your question.
Thank you, Charlotte. Hello, Mariko and Leo. Sorry, I can't open my camera. My internet is really slow at the moment. I'm just also wanted to check with you. I'm working with local communities here in the Philippines, especially now that we have kind of like started working with the ancestral water. So we are working on indigenous communities. I'm just wondering if it's something that you also kind of like support on indigenous governance in terms of marine protected areas and marine conservation as well. And also, I understand that kind of philanthropic fundings are also rooted on trust. And I'm just also wondering, how can we reach out to your institution so that we could access these fundings altogether for conservation work at the community level? Thank you.
I'm happy to start. So we have funded Indigenous governance for MPAs and marine conservation. Largely, I think in Canada is probably where I've done the most support of that work, because that had the nice Canada also was matching a lot of those philanthropic resources with their own government spending, which made it an extra big win to be investing in that country at the time. This was a couple of years ago. And so feel free to reach out to me. It's mariko@oceankind.org. But another funder that we support, so it's basically a re-grantor, that would be good to be in touch with, is this organization called Turning Tides. They're relatively new, but I was mentioning marine tenure earlier, and their mandate is to support Indigenous and local communities' marine tenure. And so I think they would take a lot of interest in that as well. And I can put you in touch with them too.
I'll echo that. We currently don't support that agenda. We used to in the early days before Turning Tides had that name, was the Marine Tenure Facility, and then through a chain of decisions, it landed on Turning Tides. I'll echo that. Like, they may be a group that is worth connecting with, very closely grounded in those agendas, and where they are located as well as an organization also connects with tenure on the terrestrial side, on land tenure. So there are lessons that I'm seeing they're trying to draw between the marine and the terrestrial space. So encouraged to connect with that group.
Is there anyone else on the line that wants to ask a question to Mariko or Leo? Okay, while they think about it, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask you both about kind of structural power that funders hold. So what practices are you using to acknowledge that structural power and then redistribute it? And who gets to say whether you're doing it well? This really gets to like the grassroots component of this conversation. Mariko, why don't you start?
This is such a good question. So I would say in general, there is more and more awareness of the need for and general enthusiasm about participatory grant making, and grant making in general being really grounded in everyday realities and shifting the power of decision making toward those individuals who are most proximate to the issues. But they are still, everyone has their own institutional barriers towards how willing they are to lean into participatory grant making approaches or how comfortable they are. I'd say we personally at Oceankind have supported a few pooled funds that try to direct the grants to the local level as much as possible by issuing small grants, because our grants tend to be on the larger side as well, so it's hard for us to do that direct grant making. So we've been supporting funds like the Frontline Community Fund that's managed at Blue Ventures, the Turning Tides Regranting Fund, and others, the Southeast Asia 30 by 30 Fund that seeks to advance conservation in Southeast Asia, all of which are really prioritizing local and community-based groups for their grants, but none of which I think have fully devolved decision-making yet to, I think they have in-region advisors for each of those pooled funds that really that have their own diligence processes and their own systems for really shaping funding priorities that are community informed or informed by the needs of the field. But in terms of decision making at Oceankind still sits with the program officers, and so all I can do really is just try to be a good listener and to try to meet partners like you whenever I can at our ocean conferences or in the field to be able to make sure that our grant making strategies or our funding priorities are grounded in the community needs. And And in terms of feedback, we do have a grantee survey. So we do ask for feedback about our funding processes, what we could do differently that would make things better, easier. If folks felt like our funding enabled them to do something that they wouldn't have otherwise. So we do try to ask questions about ourselves, but I think there's always room for improvement. So yeah, I very appreciate the question.
Yeah, I have to go next. There's I mean, I'll plus one echo what Mariko said there. It's not it's contextual to each funder, but it's if you're dealing with a strategic grant maker that it make larger grants and is not able to have like in-country staff across the different places where they work. The power does live with like at the headquarters, or it lives with the program officers who tend to be not the decision makers themselves, but the power brokers, right? Because it's a strategy that is decided above the program officer, but it goes through them. And so there's an art around how to navigate this, trying to figure out like how do you communicate these local realities that we spend a lot of time trying to learn from the field by going to the places, going to conferences, going to like peer learning networks, and how can we connect those to the existing strategies, or how can we use some of those insights when that strategy needs to be revised. And funders tend to do that every so often. We just finalized ours early this year. That imbalance never goes away, or at least I haven't seen like any practical examples of the last 4.5 years, or even in a previous philanthropic role, where that can truly go away. And it's very common for us to hear what we want to hear, and we need to build trust over time, like that gut feeling of how do we be vulnerable, explain what our strategies really are, so that when feedback comes in, we're ready to receive it. We also have a couple of things, I guess, that gets a little bit closer to that feedback piece. One is there's an internal evaluation unit that works closely with the environment program where I am, but they also run their own evaluations through like with third parties. So sometimes we hear about like feedback that we receive from grantees through them, and it's unfiltered. And so sometimes it's information that we wish we had earlier, and sometimes it's validating some of the decisions that we made along the way. And there's a third party, also a separate, that many philanthropies rely on, the Center for Effective Philanthropy, which gives a lot of mixed information about like a lot of pieces of information that philanthropies generally use, but it speaks to how responsive foundations, and in particular program officers, are to the information they receive from the field. But I'll say it never goes away, and I'm sure if we are like talking about philanthropy in general, we could all, we're not trying to reinvent how the system exists. If we had to start from scratch, ideally the world wouldn't need philanthropy, but in the context that we live, it's part of the universe. So we try as much as we can to be responsive to the needs, and incorporate feedback and knowledge as we see through the partners and through the local implementers.
I think those are really useful answers, and I just want to thank you both for being pretty vulnerable about that and transparent about it from your perspective, because I think it is kind of a tricky subject to talk about. So we have 3 minutes left. I would love to give Osias a second to ask his question. Osias, please feel free.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you very much. Bon dia, Senor Leonardo, and good morning to Morocco. Thank you for these opportunities. I'd like to raise 2 questions. I'll introduce first the organization that I work for. So Association of Tourism Koliko Manata Tauru is a community-based organization with total almost 30 members of tourism operators such as homestay, eco-lodges, hotel, restaurant, transport, local indigenous Tarabandu, which is MPA, marine protected areas on Ataruanan. So Atcoma is most focused on wildlife conservation and ecotourism. As everyone knows, that Ataru, Timor-Leste, seated on on the quadrangle center, which is rich of coral and marine species in Atoll Island. What I would like to mention is that, first of all, in Timor-Leste, many local organizations in Timor-Leste possess strong community relationship, but often face barriers in accessing large-scale international funding due to administrative and compliance requirements. So my question is, what steps are the foundations taking to increase direct funding opportunities for community-based organizations and local NGOs rather than channeling resources primarily through international intermediaries organization? So my second question, my second question is that how can your foundation investments better integrate biodiversity conservation with sustainable livelihood opportunities such as community fisheries, ecotourism, and marine enterprises and youth employment? Thank you.
Oséias, bom dia, muito prazer. I'll try to answer. I don't know that I'll have the complete response, because I think you articulated the way the funders already do this, right? It is impractical. It's almost impossible for foundations to make very small grants across the world. I'll just to give like a frame of reference of what I'm talking about. At the foundation here, I try to avoid making grants of less than $100,000. It takes a lot of internal capacity time to make them, and so if we need to make 10 grants of $20,000, it's a lot easier for us to find a fiscal sponsor or an intermediary to do that. And there have been several examples of things like that we've done in the past, including the one that I listed over on the chat a little earlier. So in general, it's a practical decision that comes from lack of capacity from foundations to truly develop relationship at the local level, unless there are place-based efforts that are bespoke to a specific location where those relationships can be built, and then different funding structures can exist. That's I would say the crude reality of funders, especially here in the US, that simply are unable to do this internationally at that scale. And then the second piece, one like how do you integrate these different dimensions? There are many ways, and in some cases, the solution or some of the intervention that is supported is exactly what you described. Like the outcomes that we, in our case, through the environment program here, the outcomes we're trying to get to on environmental conservation, biodiversity, ecosystem protection, and coastal habitats, and so on, is through ecotourism. Even if we have to go through a different route, as I mentioned earlier, trying to fundraise, trying to bring other donors to the table. So we try to, within the boundaries that each funder is able to, that needs to operate under, we try to bring those indicators. We try to, incorporate other agendas that are mindful of those local circumstances. Doesn't always work, I would say, but it's what we aspire to do within the limits that we have.
Obrigado, Senhor Leonardo.
Mariko, do you have any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, not much to add, but I would say if anything, it should be more attractive to philanthropy or to a funder if an organization is leading those holistic strategies where it's not just focused on a certain. I mean, sometimes there might be one organization that just specializes in shark science or what have you, and that's great, but I think organizations that are able to deliver across the gamut of enabling strategies, whether those are livelihoods, as well, or kind of understands all of the needs and is able to say, like, my organization is not best positioned to support with ecotourism, but I can partner with another community-based organization that is able to do that and to develop those partnerships. I think that's what's going to make these activities, ultimately the conservation interventions, stick, right? Or the interventions be more durable, is when you have those more holistic strategies in place. So I think that should be, if anything, more compelling to the philanthropic community.
That's great. We're at time. We're actually over time. So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to end this conversation. But I really want to say thanks again to Mariko and Leo. I've found this conversation really useful. I have a lot of notes and interesting tidbits to kind of follow up on. So I really appreciate it. And I know everyone here in this virtual space also really appreciates you guys taking the time. I know it's late. Mariko, you're just back from week of travel. Leo, it's 10 p.m. your time. So just want to like give a heartfelt thank you to both of you and to all of our Southeast Asia Coastal League on the line as well.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Mariko. Thank you, Leonardo.